With Lesbian Day of Visibility right around the corner, I couldn't help but wonder, how could I show butches and studs how much I adored them this time? What are you doing here? What are you doing is the better question. Just taking a few photos for my Instagram. I wasn't aware they let you post that on Instagram. What do you want? Nothing exactly. I've just been thinking. That's dangerous. It's just, I don't get it. Don't get what, exactly? The whole Butch Femme thing? What's not to get? Any of it. What is the whole Butch Femme thing? Alright, so historically speaking, Butch and Femme were more like gender identities within the larger lesbian community. Okay, but what about now? Well, see, that's the thing, because now it's complicated. It's hard to talk about something like dynamics, like relationship dynamics, gender dynamics, sex dynamics, without understanding the historical context. Not to mention that it's all very deeply personal. One person's experience is not necessarily the same as another, because a lot of other factors go into the Butch/Femme dynamic. Wait, so is it a sex thing? It depends on who you ask. In 1987, Joan Nestle wrote that Butch-Femme relationships were complex erotic statements filled with the deeply lesbian language of stance, dress, gesture, loving, courage, and autonomy. But if you ask someone like, say, Leslie Feinberg, they would have argued that that was part of her life and gender. I'm still confused. Yeah, okay, so let me see if I can make this any more clear. Keeping in mind that all of these things are more generalizations. I can't really speak for everyone in the community who identifies as either butch or stud or femme, and I certainly wouldn't want to. Right, what's the difference between butches and studs? Oh, that's actually a really good question because people tend to misuse this one a lot. So, studs are specifically black butches. So, you know, white butches on TikTok should probably stop calling themselves studs. Is that a thing? Are you surprised? Right, fair point. So, Butch and Femme are dynamics, yes, they are roles people play, but they're not costumes. There isn't like a certain thing that you wear to signify that you're femme. I mean, this doesn't hurt. It's really a part of who you are. For a lot of butches and femmes, it starts young. For butches, it starts often dressing as tomboys. Some are sort of forced into femininity by their family, and especially for butches, there's often a lot of conflict between who they understand themselves to be and who everyone else insists that they ought to be. Oh, right, like trans people. Yes, actually, that's one of the many things that trans people and butches have in common, along with a propensity to be overly sexualized against their will by the very community who's supposed to support them, but put a pin in that. More often than not, for butches and studs, people, especially their parents, sometimes even people who are close to them, really don't understand their masculinity. Unfortunately, society does not really appreciate masculinity in anyone other than men. I say this because despite what the community might have you believe, butches and studs are not necessarily women-identified people. Some of them identify as non-binary. Some of them identify specifically only as lesbians or butches and studs. Some may even use he/him pronouns or neo-pronouns like Leslie Feinberg. There's honestly a great spectrum of butchness that a lot of people don't know anything about, and that lack of understanding leads to a lot of pain. On the other side of the coin, there's femmes who often aren't seen by the lesbian community because we don't look lesbian enough. It's different for everyone, but in the case of femmes, we oftentimes look more traditionally feminine. That's not always the case, but more often than not, we tend to look traditionally feminine. We often have longer hair, we like to wear dresses, we enjoy the color pink. And sometimes that means that we aren't seen even by other lesbians because we don't look traditionally lesbian enough. Meaning we don't look like butches, which I think is sort of the prototypical idea one thinks of when one thinks of lesbians. Much like when people think of gay men, they tend to think more of ultra-feminine gay men. And that in turn has led to some people trying to break out of that mold because they don't want to be seen as a sort of stereotypical gay or lesbian. So during the 60s and 70s, the butch-femme dynamic kind of fell out of favor for this reason. It wasn't really in vogue anymore to look ultra feminine or masculine. In fact, for a while, it was kind of seen as reductive and heteronormative. And the thing of it is, despite the idea that femme automatically equals feminine, realistically being femme is about being feminine on our terms, and specifically for the butch gays. It's not at all about men. When I wear a dress or heels or makeup, I'm not doing it for the benefit of men. It's to impress butches. It's to get their attention. Frankly, if I had my way, men would not be able to perceive me at all. Oh, at all. To be clear, and I think this is really important, femme does not mean that you automatically have to wear makeup or dresses or heels or have long hair. I mean, in real life, I don't even have long hair. I just wear this for the aesthetic. The whole point is that it's femininity on your terms. It doesn't have to conform with the traditionally accepted ideals of femininity. Some femmes don't feel the need to shave certain body parts because that's their business. And the same is true for butches. It's not the heteropatriarchal idea of masculinity. You don't have to have short hair or wear flannel and button-downs all the time. Those are aspects of it, of course, and for those that feel that butchness is more of their gender, that's certainly a more gender-affirming version of it, but it's not a zero-sum game. For me, for instance, I am a femme, and I tend to like to have claws, which tends to signify to butches that I am a bottom, and in specific stone butches, it's of a lot of comfort to them. Stone butches? Again, the label stone has a lot of very personal aspects to it, but simply put, they're not interested in receiving penetration. So when I have claws, unlike now, I don't want to talk about it, I think it's very clear that when your nails are sharp and pointy, you're not doing any kind of penetrative acts. That would be horrific. In some circles, my wearing claws tends to make me more of a high femme, though I've heard some debate about whether or not high femme and stone femme mean basically the same thing, so I tend to not go for that particular moniker for myself. And look, generally speaking, while I enjoy wearing lots of clownish makeup, as has been pointed out to me by TERFs, and hair up to the heavens, and claws as sharp as I can possibly get them, although not right now, that's not always how I look or how I dress or how I am. It's a part of me, and it's a part of what I do to catch the interest of butches, but it's not the whole of me. Okay, so it's not just clothing. Clothing, I think, plays a part of it because regardless of what anyone would like the world to be, clothing has been gendered, at least in the Western world, for quite some time. And as far as I'm concerned, will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. If you're someone who enjoys dresses or makeup or nails, you will invariably be seen as feminine. Whereas if you're someone who enjoys suits and short hair and not makeup, then you will inevitably be seen as masculine. And that's not always a bad thing for someone like me. It's sort of gender affirming to be seen as feminine in this type of outfit, but it's also nice to know that I don't have to wear this to still be seen as a woman. Whether we like it or not, much of society loathes femininity, especially in men, but it seems to loathe masculinity in women almost more. And that's kind of what makes up the butch-femme dynamic. For butches, femmes are often their home, their respite away from the rest of the world that doesn't see them and doesn't understand, or even worse, actively hates them. We are the stopgap between butches and the vitriol of the world. And because of that, we're often naturally very protective of butches because we want to be. As I have said time and time again, I make these videos because I want to be this voice. More than anything, I want butches and studs to hear my words and to understand that this is deeply, deeply important to me. As a femme, I take this incredibly seriously, and it's important to me that I get it right because I want to be that home and a protection for butches and studs. Because as much as butches and studs want to protect their femmes from men in particular, femmes want to protect their butches and studs from the outside world, including sometimes other women. Now, I would be remiss not to talk about the fact that sexual dynamics do play a part in this. As I mentioned earlier, butches and studs are often overly sexualized against their will because of their masculinity. And there's a very unfortunate thing that goes along with that if you're a butch or a stud, you're kind of expected to be dominant and in charge at all times, which isn't always the case. I think a lot of butches feel very uncomfortable with the idea that they're supposed to be strong and hard and they're not really allowed to have emotions or feelings or even not want to be in charge in sexual situations. And all of this leads to the problem where lesbians and even non-lesbians tend to view butches and studs as sexual objects rather than actual people. And I think that's part of the reason I'm a little hesitant to say that this is specifically a sex-based or sexual-based dynamic, because while it is a part of it, I think it's just one part of a greater whole. And one of the problems becomes that when sex becomes part of the narrative, sometimes it can feel like the entire narrative, and that feels like that's all anybody wants to talk about. Frankly, as a trans woman, someone who has been hypersexualized more by men than by women, although I have seen it with women as well, I understand this very, very well. One of the problems is that people tend to see you as more of an object for their pleasure, and your own pleasure in the matter becomes irrelevant. And frankly, this can cause its own dysphoria, and for that matter, its own feelings of frustration and mistrust. At its heart, the butch-femme dynamic, to me at least, is really about how we are there for each other, how we communicate with each other, how we interact with each other. It's about protecting one another from a world that ultimately chooses not to understand us. And let me be clear, I recognize that I am far more fortunate than most, because the reality is, while I am a trans lesbian, I am still a white trans lesbian, one who has a great deal of cis passing privilege and, let's be honest, straight passing privilege, which means that I don't experience near the harassment that a lot of butches and studs do both online and off. In the real world, I just don't see that. The reality of it is, I do not receive the same amount of mistreatment and harassment that gays and lesbians and trans women of color face both online and off on a nearly constant basis. I will never know what that's like. No matter how hard it is for me as a trans lesbian, I know that my experience does not equal theirs. And frankly, to my fellow white queer people, we need to do better. We need to do better for queer people of color because they need our help. I've talked at length about the subject of infighting within our community. It's been something that's been going on pretty much since the dawn of time. Whether it's the gay community wanting to dump the trans community back at the start of the queer rights movement, or gays versus lesbians versus bi people versus the trans community again. It's all a constant influx of just eating our own. The infighting between all of our communities, the mistrust and mistreatment of bisexuals, the racism, the misogyny, frankly, even the self-loathing lesphobia and homophobia that exists within our community. It all infects far too much of our community. This infighting is dangerous. A danger to any one of us should be seen clearly for what it is, as a danger to all of us. And if we let one in our community down, we let the whole community down. And we as the white queer community need to do better. There is no other option at this point. Because whether we realize it or not, there is a very real enemy out there that seeks to destroy us. I can't argue with you there, but I guess my only question now is like, why? Isn't it a little hypocritical to be in a relationship that mimics heteronormativity? I should think the fact that we're both lesbians should insist that it's not imitating heteronormativity. Right, but one is masculine and one is feminine. That doesn't feel heteronormative to you? Masculinity and femininity are not concepts that are exclusive to heteronormative or even cisnormative society. Besides, just because someone's masculine doesn't necessarily mean that they're in charge. With you they are. And why not just date men? Because I don't want to. I've dated men. I've done it. I've been down that road. I have absolutely no interest. And I think it's okay that while I have no interest in men, I still have an interest in masculinity. That's not exclusive to men. Look at it this way. Why do you date men? I've never really thought about it. Exactly. Because straight people don't have to think about why they're straight. They don't ever have to ponder what life would be like if they weren't straight, and they don't have to explain their sexuality to anyone. Nobody questions heterosexuality. But if you're gay, especially if you're trans and gay, suddenly everyone's confused. How does that work? Why not just stay the gender you were assigned at birth and date the opposite sex? The truth of the matter is, it's nobody's business why. Even people who may be well-intentioned like yourself don't have a right to know why I identify as anything. I don't come into your life asking you to explain yourself. Why? Because it's not my business. The fact of the matter is, I've worked hard to come to terms with who I am, to accept myself for who I am. And believe me, it's been confusing for me too. Do you really think this is where I expected to end up at 29? I've touched on this a little bit in various videos, but I'm someone who grew up with a vague inkling of my gender identity at a very young age, but who completely lacked the language to be able to do anything about it or even attempt to explain it to anyone. That femininity that I had from a very young age never really went away, and people just assumed I was gay because of it, and that felt right enough. But actually, and it's funny that I just remembered this now, it's something that's pretty common in the Butch-Femme dynamic that actually made me realize that I was trans. Chivalry. So within Butch-Femme dynamics, there are also like subdivisions, including one called OFOS, or old-fashioned old school, which is modeled on more of like the 50s version. I think generally speaking, chivalry kind of bleeds into all parts of the Butch-Femme dynamic. I remember from a very young age always wanting to have someone to hold open a door for me, or pull out my chair for me, or, you know, treat me like a lady. And that phrasing is kind of important. But it was that specific phrasing that made me realize that actually I'm not a gay man, because gay men are still men and want to be treated as men, and the fact that I want to be treated as a woman, it all just kind of made things fall into place. It forced me to look at how I think about myself and how I pictured myself, how I imagined I would be or could be in the future. And in every single version I had ever imagined for myself since I could remember, I was always a woman. But even then, even with all of that information, it still took me kind of a long time to come to terms with my gender and sexuality. Frankly, if you had told me when I first came out at 16 that in roughly 13 years I would be fully transitioned and now a lesbian, I would have laughed you off the face of the earth because it was never on my radar as a possibility. But the reality is, sexuality and gender are complicated. There isn't always a quick and simple solution, and sometimes as you live your life, your thoughts and your interests change. Your desires change. Who you thought you were evolves, and that's okay. Now's a good time to bring this up. I think in the queer community, there is this thing where we assume that once you come out, you sort of have to stick to that. You come out, you do the whole thing, and now you have to stay with that. And I think it kind of limits us to who we can be and what we can do. We fight so hard to have our sexuality and our gender taken seriously that we tend to fight against this idea that something could change, because if it can change, that means that maybe when someone says it's a phase, that's not wrong. Or if it can change, that means that all that we had to go through, all that trouble, all that work we had to do to prove to everyone that this is who we are and it's not a phase and it's not something that you can just pray away, seems like it's for nothing. Because if you can change, if your sexuality can change, if your gender can change, if things can just change or you can realize things about yourself, then it calls into question everything we have worked so hard and fought so hard for as a community and as individual people. And unfortunately, that means that anytime someone doesn't fall in line with what our expectations for them are, there can be a lot of anger and resentment and feelings of betrayal. I remember when Elliot Page came out as a trans man, I saw a lot of like love and support for him, but I also saw a lot of like feelings of betrayal from the lesbian community that like, oh, we lost another one, and like this kind of very strange and unfortunate rhetoric that followed his transition. And this is a very unfortunate TERF narrative that I think follows around trans men specifically. This narrative that continues that lesbianism will die because butches or masculine lesbians would rather become men because somehow that's an easier alternative, which proves how little they understand about being trans, but that's beside the point. But I think this idea about the death of lesbians in particular is kind of very popularized, especially by TERFs, but it's something that sort of seeps into all aspects of lesbianism, and it's kind of the reason that some people don't like the idea of bisexual women calling themselves butches or femmes. And I think now is a good time to say that that's the least of our problems. Look, I hate to break it to you, but if you really think a bisexual woman calling herself a butch or a femme is the worst thing in our community, you are not living in reality. You can be butch or femme. I don't agree with the idea of bisexual lesbians because I know that's a TERF thing to discount lesbian women who like trans women. Don't start with me. However, you can be bisexual and still be a butch or a femme. The unfortunate thing is that all of this fear goes back to the betrayal or the feelings of betrayal. There's this idea that we are already a very, very small community. The queer community is very small, but the lesbian community is even smaller within the overarching queer community. Sure, 1 in 6 Gen Zers are some flavor of queer, but what does that actually mean in terms of community? I think you can generously argue that the queer community makes up maybe 10% of the population of the entire world. And again, that's a generous estimate. I am no mathematician or statistician for that matter. And that's like the entire LGBTQIA+++. And that's including that there's overlap between the L, the G, the B, the T. And with women making up roughly half the population, you figure lesbians make 5% of that 10% world LGBTQIA. And so if you have 5% of a already small population, if even one or a couple prominent, formerly lesbian people come out as trans, that feels like a shrinking population. It's not entirely dissimilar to why some trans people don't really appreciate the whole detransition narrative. We fight really hard to be taken seriously as our sexuality or gender. And when someone, for whatever reason, just realizes that, hey, maybe this isn't who I really am, maybe this isn't what I want, or maybe I just can't handle what the expectations are of being this gender that I thought I was, it feels like a betrayal. During my senior year of high school, I was pretty openly gay and very obviously feminine. And for me, I didn't really feel like I had an option not to be out and not to be public and not to be as open as I could possibly be, because I had tried that for years and years and years. People made their assumptions either way, and I wanted to take back my narrative, as it were. But a lot of people that I knew tended to say they were gay one day, and then the next day they suddenly weren't gay anymore. And for me at the time, this was super frustrating because it felt like they were just choosing who they wanted to be as the day went on. And I didn't have that option, so why should they? It was the mentality of, why do you get to live outside the rules and bounds of sexuality when I don't? The reality is, and I think something of an unpopular opinion, life is complicated. Sexuality and gender are complicated. Sometimes life takes you in strange places that you never expected. That doesn't mean that any of your past experiences are no longer relevant or didn't happen or that it was a phase. It just means you changed. Nothing is ever as simple as A or B. I personally don't picture myself ever falling in love with a man again, but I can't say with 100% certainty that it will never happen. Being a lesbian was certainly something I never expected to happen. YouTube was certainly never on my list of things I expected to happen for myself. Neither was talking about Butch Femme dynamics. When I started this, I desperately just wanted to be a beauty YouTuber, which in hindsight, I'm glad that didn't work out. I never imagined that this is what I would become known for, or that this beautiful community would grow out of it and become so deeply important to me. Sometimes if you let it, life can take you in completely unexpected and wonderful places. And as someone who is almost 30, I've kind of learned that the only way to be truly happy is just enjoy the journey. Look, I tried fighting my original sexuality and my gender identity for so long that by the time I realized I was a lesbian, I was like, sure, why not? It's exhausting to try and constantly fight yourself about who you are, especially about something as simple and complicated as who you love. If we as a community truly mean what we say when we say love is love, then I think we have to extend that to members of our community who realize that the love that they have now is not what it was when you first said that to them. Just as a final statement, I would like to offer my heartfelt thanks to the Butch Femme community, particularly on Tumblr, who has been so amazingly kind and helpful and wonderful to me. I have made so many amazing friends, people who truly mean the world to me. I am by no means an expert on any of these topics. I'm just someone with a great deal of opinions who tried to research this as much as possible, and a very big shout out to my friend Des, who made all of this possible. Thank you so, so much. I really could not have done any of this without you. I really did the best I could to explain what's a pretty complex topic in the simplest terms that I could, but to be honest, there's so many layers to the Butch Femme dynamic that I could be here all day trying to explain it as thoroughly and complexly as possible. The reality is there is decades upon decades of history and queer theory that go into all of this, but life isn't lived in theory. Life is just lived in practice, which for me in particular becomes a little complicated because as much as I talk about them and as much as I have an obvious love for butches and studs, I've never actually had the pleasure of dating one. Not for a lack of trying, I can assure you. My experiences in lesbianism are currently a little more theoretical than actual lived experiences. So I think it's important to note that when I talk about all of these things when it comes to butch-femme dynamics, it's important for me to stipulate that my understanding of how butch-femme dynamics work are not necessarily everyone's understanding of how butch-femme dynamics work. Because as I've said throughout this video, it's a deeply personal thing built on lived experiences. Everyone's experiences are inevitably going to be different, and their experiences with the butch-femme dynamic are going to be different because of it. I personally don't believe that there is a right or wrong way to be butch or femme. You are butch enough just as you are, and you are femme enough just as you are. Butch and femme are not uniforms that you put on. They aren't costumes, they are a part of who you are. And yes, you can dress them up and adorn them to get more attention, as I do here, but that isn't a requirement. You're still femme even if you have short hair, or don't wear makeup, or don't shave your legs. You are still butch if you have long hair and maybe like nail polish. You don't want to wear cargo shorts today. Every femme that I know is, above all things, deeply protective of butches. We protect them from a world that does not understand them and unfortunately was not built for them. Being a home for our butch, being a place of respite, loving them not in spite of their butchness but because of it, that's everything. If you take away nothing else from this video, take away the understanding that at the core of it, the butch-femme dynamic is about taking care of each other. It's about loving one another and respecting one another and fighting for one another. And know this, though I make it clear in every video, I will say it again. I will fight for butches and studs no matter what. I will stand up for you. I will be in your corner and I will show you that love that you deserve. Because I don't want any butch to ever question themselves or feel like there's no one out there who understands and sees them for exactly who they are. I see you, and you matter. You are important, and you are worth caring about.